Hey everyone, welcome to the LinkedIn Presents Redefining Work podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt, and today I'm joined by my friend, Amy Schultz. Amy is the global head of talent acquisition at, I'm going to like fanboy over this a little bit because it's a company that I use probably daily.
Yes.
And the cool part about it is I get to use it with my daughter as well, but Canva. So big fan of the platform. I can't wait to pick your brain and learn a little bit more about how you do what you do and how you've led the scale and growth there. But before we even get into that, we got to start with introductions. So what should the audience know about you, Amy?
Oh, hi, Lars. Well, thank you so much, first and foremost, for having me on. And I'm a big fan of your show, as you know. So it's such a treat to be talking to you today. So what's to know about me? Well, I work at Canva, as you mentioned. I live in Australia and recently actually had a full circle moment where I moved back to my hometown. Albury. And so for overseas listeners, that Albury is a town halfway between Melbourne and Sydney in Australia. And, it's kind of the new world of work where I get to do a global role helping to build and scale Canva from my hometown. So I don't take that for granted. And it's been really nice to be closer to family and friends after I left home at 18 and have lived overseas for about 7 years in China, Singapore, and the US. It never thought that I would be back here, Lars, but here I am.
Yeah. Well, here you are. Awesome to hear that you're back home. We had a chance to meet in,
Yes.
I think, San Francisco last time at one of the recent Talent Connects. And I want to, as much as I have questions about Canva, I want to actually hit the rewind button a little bit from where you are today to where you were before you joined Canva, which was LinkedIn. I think one of the things that LinkedIn does really well is their tour of duty model. And I think that was when Reed brought that into the organization, and the way they look at the employer-employee relationship, I think is so smart. And it's never actually been more relevant than in today's world of work. And so, having been through there, I know you spent 6 years at LinkedIn. I know that took you around the world in a variety of different roles. Tell me a little bit about both experiencing that tour of duty as an employee, but then also as somebody running recruiting teams, using that as a method to hire and attract talent.
And you realize now, looking back, what an integral part of LinkedIn's culture that was. I think that concept of tour of duty and also next play. Yeah. And at every all hands, while Jeff Weiner was CEO and potentially Ryan continues this now, Jeff would always say talent is our number one operating priority. And that was a consistent message, at all hands, at company meetings. And Jeff often said, consistency over time builds trust. And so that was really ingrained in the culture, I think, from leadership down, that talent was LinkedIn's number one operating priority, and I'm sure still is. And that this concept of tour of duty was, I see it now as such a vital exchange. And an exchange between both, the company and the employee, that there's a goal, there's a mission, and that potentially you have the skills to help see that mission through and achieve that goal for the business. And in exchange, you get valuable experiences as well. And when Reed wrote the book, The Alliance, he was so, ahead of his time, which I think Reed often is. And I refer to that book a lot, both, externally on LinkedIn and also internally. And I love the concept that even when a employment arrangement ends, the relationship doesn't have to end. And LinkedIn for me is such a wonderful example of that. There is not a day that goes by, honestly, where I don't have some contact with someone that I worked with LinkedIn, whether they're still there or not. I continue to be a customer, a member of LinkedIn. So my alliance continues. Yeah. And companies have such an opportunity to do that, be that with, an alumni program or just those just down to human connection. The world is a big, small place. And maybe you go from being a employee to a customer. But whatever that might be, there's that connection remains, and you can be a company's biggest talent brand ambassador. And the tour of duty concept, I think, was for me such an unlock, because you mentioned it took me around the world. It honestly changed my life professionally and personally. And having that be spoken about and celebrated and recognized at a company, I think is so important, because internal mobility can be hard, Lars.
Yeah.
And particularly for organizations that might not be growing and might feel like they don't have, a ton of incremental headcount to ask. So that can sometimes create this culture of scarcity, right? And people want to hold on to their talent and not sort of encourage them to explore and move elsewhere. And that's such a loss, I think, for the individual, potentially for the hiring manager, and also for the company. When anyone joins my team, I chat to them all during onboarding, and I say to them, like, you're here because of the skills that you bring, and then my role and my team's role is helping you bring those skills to life at Canva. You're a great recruiter, you're a great sourcer, but now we're helping you be great at Canva. And I hope that the skills that you get on this team sets you up for whatever next, and whatever that might be. And hopefully that's at Canva. And you look back and you go, well, it's because of that experience or that exposure or that project, whatever it might be, that I had, that's now set me up for whatever comes next.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that perspective as somebody who's gone through that. And I think it's a refreshingly honest way to think about the employer-employee experience, right? It's just like too often it's vague, it's nebulous. It's like, you're here, like you should be committed to us like lifelong. Well, you know what? As we've seen in these layoffs in tech over the last, 2 years, like there's no lifelong commitment. And we just have to be real about it. And if we say, hey, look, you're going to be here for 2 years. These are the skills and experiences that you're going to gain. They're going to make you more marketable. Here are the ways that you're going to impact our business. Here's the products you're going to build, the services you'll help deliver, whatever it might be. You're just honest about that kind of win-win relationship and talk candidly about, hey, look, you know what? Maybe after 2 years, we're not going to be the right fit for you anymore, or you for us. But being able to have that conversation openly, what I think it also does is it creates an environment. You talk about alumni networks, right? Where there is a lot of value in being a great place to be from.
Yes.
In addition to being a great place to be. And I think when you don't hoard your talent, when you don't have that scarcity mindset, and most companies do, let's be honest, most companies do have a scarcity mindset.
Yes,
they do talent and internal mobility. But I think if you can find a way to unlock that, and I think particularly in LinkedIn's case with, through Reed, through Jeff, that was kind of really drilled down from top down. It created that environment where talent was much more fluid. And that'll be a segue in a minute to get into some of your talent mobility programs at Canva.
Oh, we love it.
But I don't want to jump the shark. I feel like we have to go to chronological order here.
No, I love that. I love that. And like, no gold watch here, Lars.
Yeah.
I worked at a services company in Australia many years ago, and there was a head of HR there for a number of years, and they were like, I'll say a bit fairly traditional. They referred to us as personnel. They used to have their emails printed, and you would get emails back with like red marker. But I always remember attending a farewell of someone that was leaving the team, and the head of HR was like, really happy. And I'm like, how come you're so happy that they're leaving? And he was like, well, I know that they wouldn't be moving to this next job if it weren't for us and the experience that they had. And like, how can you not feel proud of that? And like, for someone I viewed them fairly traditional, I that was such a unlock moment. And then, years later working at LinkedIn, I saw that sort of, living and breathing that kind of mindset every day. And that has definitely stayed with me.
Yeah. So let's talk Canva for a moment. So, I imagine most listeners and viewers are familiar with Canva. If you follow me, you're certainly familiar with Canva, because I'm usually,
super
talking
use
about
Lars. Not all the capes,
And by the way, I'm not a paid spokesperson for Canva.
No.
I'm just, for people who may not be familiar, I'll rewind it for a moment. Like, I'm a wannabe designer. If I had to do my career over again, I probably would have pursued design. I love design. I'm passionate about just, learning more about design, but I have no actual design skills.
Yes, you do. I've seen
but
that.
I do. Well, okay, I should take that back. Because of Canva, because of Canva, I can build the things that I can imagine, but I wouldn't have the technical skills to be able to create otherwise. Like, I can't use Figma, I can't use Adobe products, but I can build things in Canva. And I've actually gotten good at being able to find design that I like, find things that inspire me on the design side, and then be able to actually kind of reverse engineer how I build that in Canva. And to me, I wouldn't be able to do any of that without a platform like that. So anyway, maybe that is an ad. You could clip that. That could become an ad for Canva. But for the audience that may not be familiar with the company, like, can you give an overview? In particular, I'd love for you to describe the growth, because I think that it's been, just this massive success story in terms of the growth of the business. So, maybe take us back to when you joined, size the company today, size of your team when you joined, size of your team today, just to help kind of level set for the audience.
Well, I love, hearing your story of using Canva, Lars, and you are why we exist. So our CEO and our co-founder, Mel Perkins, was lecturing at a university and could see how students were really struggling to use the software to learn how to design. And she was like, there's got to be a simpler way, right? And so our vision is, and our mission is, to empower the world to design, design anything on any device, in any language, with any ingredient. And the company now is 10 years old. We celebrated a decade last year, and we are now used by over 170 million monthly active users, which is wild. I joined Canva just over 3 years ago, and around that, we were around 1,100 employees then, and fast forward to now, I think we're about 4,500, give or take, probably a few offers that have gone out in the course of this conversation, Lars. And we have offices, our HQ is Australia, Sydney, and we also have an office in Melbourne and co-working spaces around Australia. And we're in China, Philippines. I just got back from visiting our Manila office, San Francisco, Austin, London, Prague, and Vienna.
Okay.
And it's been really cool to help Canva scale our global footprint. And when I joined Canva, I think the TA team was about 30, and had doubled the size of Canva in that past year, and had done really well at scaling and finding great talent with kind of very little strategy or structure. And it was a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to move back to Australia and join an Australian-based tech company and be able to take the amazing experience that I'd had from LinkedIn and most recently helping to build their product organization and bring that back to a company and a product that people loved. Even like three plus years ago, I was so surprised when I told people that I was joining Canva, how many people were like, oh my God, I love Canva, I use Canva, or my daughter uses Canva, or I just taught my grandma to use it, or whatever it might be. The use cases were so diverse, and people loved the product. And, it was helping small businesses through COVID. We give Canva away to not-for-profits. It's used in schools. And we have we call a simple two-step plan to be one of the most valuable companies in the world, but to also do the most good we can do. And having worked in the Valley and seen the wealth creation that tech has created for many, to then and for for LinkedIn to have had such a I think an egalitarian mission for so long to to help create an economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce, to join a similar mission-driven company was really important to me, and it is definitely been that and then some. It's a wild ride. Going back to a startup, potentially 2 decades from when my career first started in a startup. Still a bit different, Lars. I don't necessarily have this the same vim and vigor that I may have had back in my 20s. And then all of a sudden you look around and sometimes you're the most experienced person in the room. You're like, how'd that happen? But it's been cool. And I think it was a big unlearning and relearning journey for me, particularly in that first 6 months. And you come to Canva for the skills and experience that you bring and to help Canva achieve its big crazy goals. And one of probably the key learnings that I had in the first sort of 3 to 6 months is figuring out what is going to work best for Canva, and not just doing something because it's best practice or this is the playbook that you've brought from your previous company here. That might still be the right approach, but advice that I got from Cliff, our COO and co-founder early on, is like, I don't care what's best practice. Like, figure out what's going to work for Canva and then go and see who else has sorted that out. And maybe what you end up recommending is best practice, but don't start from there.
Yeah.
And that was like, and that's something that I, share with folks during their listening tour when they join, and particularly, leaders, because the more experience we get, let's be honest, Lars, even with a growth mindset, learning agility, we get a little bit more stuck in our ways. And that sort of adaptability and that learner's mindset, and kind of leaving your ego a little bit to one side, is a critical component of, I think, thriving at somewhere like Canva and also having impact.
Yeah. Well, it's great advice in terms of best practices, because again, I think if you're trying to chase what works for somebody else, there's not even no guarantees that's going to work. It's probably not going to work.
Yeah.
It's probably not going to work in your environment. Yeah. So like, you have to get your arms around a range of different practices. Yes. You have to learn, be inspired by, maybe take pieces and components of different organizations and how they do things, but you got to then localize that back to what you're doing. And maybe that's going to end up being something that looks a lot like what somebody else is doing. Probably not. And so, it's a lot of freedom to be able to give you that mandate and to kind of go that way.
And that was really important to me, Lars. Like, when I was going through the recruiting process at Canva, I had worked at other startups earlier in my career, and I had seen situations where the company like, right, we need to bring on, these set of experiences to take us from here to here. So we must go out and hire senior leaders. And then you see senior leaders come in and then they're not kind of able to do what they want to do or what they were brought on to do. And then you sort of see said senior leaders exit stage door left because they weren't perhaps given that sort of autonomy and trust. And I really dug into that during the hiring process and spoke to a bunch of different leaders, spoke to our founders to kind of get a sense of that, and have been super fortunate that I have been given a ton of trust and autonomy. And Cliff, I think he sees himself as an extension of the TA team, and loves recruiting, loves closing. So having founders that actually understand the strategic importance of the team and how without this team, Canva can't, scale to over, 170 million monthly active users. Like that is so important. And I think has also kind of helped us, ride the waves over the last couple of years. And at Canva, we're fortunate to be a steady ship. But without, I think, the trust and the demonstrated impact, as we've seen, you mentioned before, like with layoffs, they have definitely adversely impacted HR and recruiting teams, right? And we're really fortunate to still be growing at Canva, but I don't take that for granted. And I think we need to be thinking about ways that we can future-proof what we do. And in order to do that, we need to continue to evolve how we do it.
Yeah. I'd love to kind of expand on that a little bit more. You talked about your relationship with Cliff and like how he loves recruiting and, views himself as a closer, which is, something you definitely want to see in your,
Yes,
co-founder.
always be closing.
But as you mentioned, that trust is like the foundation for everything,
Yes.
right? And I think as somebody in your role, you're working very closely with the founding team, with the executives, you're helping them hire their executives. There's times you may see something in a candidate that they may not, that you're trying to influence them one way or another. Sometimes, people might get smitten on an aspect of a candidate's background, but that may be forcing them to overlook other aspects. And your role as the head of TA is to kind of pull them back from that and
Yes.
to influence them in the right way, which can't be done without trust. So tell me a little bit about how you build that. This is, I guess, question is more framed for your peers. So people who are running TA in other organizations, and maybe they're working for founder executives as well, who, again, feel that real ownership of the company. They have a real point of view around like the person they want to bring in leadership roles. How do you build that trust, particularly in times where you may have to give feedback and counsel on a candidate that might run counter to what their views are?
Yes. I mean, trust is such a nebulous thing, is it not?
Yeah.
And I think, when you're working in startups, working with founders, like sometimes that is just instinctual. It can just come down to chemistry at times. And, I think what I learned from my time at LinkedIn was that trust is, consistency and competency over time. And, doing what you say you will, I've said I'm going to do this and then I do that and demonstrating impact. And also, meeting the business, meeting the founders, the executives, whoever it might be, where they're at, and trying to communicate in the language and in the format that is relevant for them. And I learned this from working with Ryan for a number of years, Ryan Roslansky, be bright, be brief, be gone. And that, that has stuck with me. And I think when you build the best relationships with people, it's when you're helping them solve a problem, Lars. And I'm often asked, for advice on how to build relationships with this executive, be it ones I work with Canva now or perhaps folks that I've worked with previously. And they're like, they won't meet with me or they won't invite me to this thing. And I'm like, well, have you helped them solve a problem? Like, do you know what's keeping them up at night? Like what their business objectives or goals are? And then have you thought about how you might be able to help them with that? Have you asked them like what's kind of their biggest problem right now? And we're in such a unique position in recruiting because sometimes their biggest problem is hiring. be it that, that role for their leadership team or just their ability to attract talent, whatever that might be. We can actually get in the door and build that trust, demonstrating our competency in recruiting, and then that consistency over time. And when you are able to kind of demonstrate impact, then you can have those tougher conversations about pushing back on, hey, like I know you really like Lars because of XYZ reasons, but let me tell you how he's kind of been showing up in his conversations with the recruiter or with our recruiting coordinator. And that's giving me some red flags around whether they might be a culture add or a values alignment. And we have pulled offers because of how candidates have treated our team. Yeah. And Cliff has said, hey, like if you're getting a feel, tell me and we will pull that offer. And we have done that. And I think that is really empowering for the team, right? And they realize that candidate experience is so important to us, and we're critiqued and we're evaluated based on the experience that we create for candidates, and that relationship is a two-way street. And we're assessing you on how you communicate, how you present yourself, and we're also assessing you on how you show up and you treat people. And so that I think is a really cool thing about Canva and how our leaders view, like our team, and also the importance that they put on every hire. Like every hire matters, and still at 4,500 employees, Lars, every hire matters. And you know, that can maybe feel sometimes frustrating to the team, but for me, I'm like, that will always mean that when every hire matters, our team matters and what we do matters. And that means that we have to step up our game every day, because Canva is a different company every day. It's a different company to what it was yesterday. It'll be a different company tomorrow. Therefore, we need to be continually like evolving what we do and how we do it.
Yeah. I mean, look, your culture changes with every hire
Yes.
you make,
Yeah.
even at that size and scale.
Yes.
So I think, again, I love the way you tie that back to the importance of recruiting and empowering your team and reinforcing how much you matter. Let's talk about your team for a minute. And I'd love to get a sense of like, how do you use Canva to recruit for Canva?
It's so meta. And you know, again, this was some really valuable experience I got from LinkedIn, where we had this concept of LinkedIn on LinkedIn. You know, and you know, you're in the recruiting team at LinkedIn. You're using LinkedIn to recruit people for LinkedIn. And I saw I've seen the stickiness, right? That tying your talent brand to your consumer brand can have, and the ability to convert candidates to potential users. And like maybe 3 years ago, Lars, like not every candidate who we reached out to had used Canva. That has changed now. You know, we received over 400,000 job applications last year, and I would imagine that we'll probably receive close to 500,000 this year, which is nuts. But whether someone gets a job at Canva, like I want them to feel like that experience has been a value exchange for them. So very quickly after I joined, we saw an opportunity to give candidates that kind of got to our challenge stage a Canva Pro subscription for free. So they could continue to experiment and learn and use Canva whether they get a job with us or not. So starting to kind of, you know, convert that flywheel of candidates to users, and then thinking, well, hey, how can we embed Canva at each kind of key moment of our hiring process to help create peak moments for candidates? So we use it for our talent brand and engagement materials that maybe we might, you know, send a prospect when we reach out. We use Canva docs and presentations for our interview prep material. We obviously gift Canva Pro to candidates at a certain stage of the process. We use it in our offer and onboarding materials, because we kind of noticed that like an offer should be a peak moment for candidates, but often it's kind of boring. Like you have that sort of that conversation, you're like, yay, and then you get this kind of like boring letter or contract, and you're like,
here's a PDF.
Feels a bit a bit anticlimactic. So we have embedded our use of Canva docs and presentations at those kind of key peak moments. And I'd say it was not last year, the year before, I spoke at a conference here in Australia, a talent conference, and my keynote was on, can creativity and TA coexist? I'm like, hell yeah, it can. And just because you don't see yourself as a creative doesn't mean that there aren't ways that you can kind of train yourself to be a little bit more creative, and shared examples of how we use Canva to, you know, inspire creativity in our hiring process. And off the back of that, we worked with our product team, our templates team, to turn a lot of our materials into templates for other HR and recruiting teams to use on Canva. So that was kind of a really nice sort of full circle moment, and bringing that sort of concept of customer zero to life. And now, you know, our sales teams see HR and recruiting teams as like a segment to build relationships with and potentially introduce, you know, Canva usage to, and that's cool.
Yeah. I mean, look, you're in an interesting company where recruiting can not just be a cost center, but a profit driver in some ways, because you're constantly out there touching people who may or may not be customers, and based on the experience they have with your recruiting team, become customers, or perhaps be turned off of becoming customers. That candidate experience, the way that you interact, the way that you treat candidates is just, especially in an environment like yours, is so critical.
Yes.
I want to get a sense from you, like when you think about, like, there's so many things that are impacting the world of recruiting today, but certainly one that I think is at the forefront is generative AI. And obviously there's lots of generative AI woven into capabilities of Canva, but as a TA leader, like, how do you think about embracing generative AI for your, for the organization, for your growth?
Well, it's interesting, Lars, towards the end of last year, Canva commissioned a study with a company called Sago, and we surveyed, I think it was around 5,000 job seekers globally and 5,000 hiring managers. And what was super interesting to me that came out of some of the findings was that 90% or 91% of hiring managers that we surveyed believe that using generative AI is acceptable for candidates, in their application materials in some form. And 45% of job seekers that we spoke to had said that they had used generative AI to build or update or improve their resume. And of those that had used it, over 70% said that that had made their experience easier. So there is a tool here that can help job seekers, I think, cut through the noise. And the job search process is more visual. Social media, LinkedIn kind of like set the ball rolling, ages ago on that. And I feel like now there is the ability to accelerate. I think a job's candidates' ability to make their application materials stand out and even demonstrate their visual communication and design skills more. And what I took away was that hiring managers are wanting to see more visual communication and design skills from candidates during the hiring process, and they're okay with generative AI use, right, in some shape or form. So for TA, what I think we need to take away from these findings is, okay, candidates are starting to use it. Hiring managers are okay with it. How are we then using it in our hiring process? How are we guiding candidates to use it and have, I guess, a point of view or some guidelines on what acceptable use is? And then how are we ensuring that we are really upping our game when it comes to digging a little bit deeper and probing on a candidate's problem solving or critical reasoning or collaboration or communication skills, right? Like the onus then becomes on us to go that level deeper on skills. And then if hiring managers are okay with generative AI and they're looking for more visuals from candidates, then that's a signal to us in how we communicate back to hiring managers and how we need to be thinking about pulling together our updates or sharing back insights, etc. So I see it as an enabler. I don't yet view generative AI as something that can really help us assess talent, but it can certainly help make the experience better and more efficient, ideally for recruiters, for candidates, and for hiring managers. And it's on us to start experimenting. It's on us to start, finding use cases and having a point of view, because Lars, we've seen it, right? Like we know the speed in which generative AI is developing. And I think if we don't have a point of view as an industry, that point of view will be created for us.
Yeah. And to us. Right. Yeah. I think that's a really important point. And I think you touched on something there that I just want to kind of underscore is that our role as leaders in the business, and that's, whether you're a TA leader, an HR leader, it doesn't matter. If you work in this discipline, your role as a leader in the business is to be able to communicate in effective ways and articulate points in effective ways, and having visual communication skills in addition to verbal and written and digital, frankly, I think we need all of those to be effective and to really make compelling cases. And we can't just show up to these meetings with like an Excel spreadsheet, right? Or like a tired, as you mentioned, like we can't be giving offers that are just like tired, complex PDF like word blocks. Like if we can break that up and we can bring more visual, presentation to it, it's going to have our ideas, no matter how effective they are, be received in a different way. And I think that's a skill that we need to develop. So I'm glad you touched on that.
It is. I mean, I think it's async communication, right? Like whether we are someone that is in the office full time or whether we're someone that is working from home full time, like we are working in a hybrid environment and we leverage async communication every day, and being able to communicate succinctly using visuals is such a powerful way to cut through. Bringing it back to, the job seeker experience, like on average, a recruiter spends, I think, between 7 to 8 seconds reviewing a CV before, making a decision on whether they're going to, pick up the phone or what have you. So visuals can kind of cut through. And likewise, like we receive so many Slacks, emails, texts on a daily basis, and the context switching of leaders and executives nowadays is real, right? And we jump from meeting to meeting, Zoom call to Zoom call. So you do need to think about the audience and what is the best way to communicate what you want to get across, so that meeting is both valuable for you and potentially also for the executive. And I think visual communication is one really powerful way of doing that. And data only becomes insights when it has, I guess, a recommendation. And if there's a way of being able to communicate that recommendation more creatively, so it's more memorable, then we should do that.
Yeah. Well, Amy, it's been a pleasure learning more about your path at both LinkedIn and Canva, your experience and the team and the rocket ship that you're building at Canva. So if any of the audience wants to get a hold of you after the show, is LinkedIn the best way to do that?
Yeah, by all means, follow me, connect with me. I do spend a fair bit of time on LinkedIn and both, sort of share my point of view, but also what's happening in at Canva, and our career page, Life at Canva, is also a great one to check out. And we have a talent community that folks can join on there as well. And if you haven't ever tried Canva, give it a go. There's tons of free content on there that you can start to play with, and you too can become a skilled super user like Lars.
That bar is low, so you can join me as a
relative.
That's true. That's fair enough. But Amy, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your work and your time with all of us, and all the best with continuing to build Canva.
Oh, cheers. Bye-bye.